All right. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Please go ahead and, just want to say this before I forget, if you can turn off your cell phones, that would be great. But welcome to another in Newton for Everyone series of educational events. We're so grateful for all of you guys for coming out tonight and to the 125 or so folks we have on the Zoom. In case you're not familiar with us here at Newton for Everyone, we are a pro-housing organization advocating for diverse housing opportunities for people of all ages, means, backgrounds, and abilities here in Newton. And so last time we spoke heard about the development of subsidized affordable housing from Jason Korb. It was a great presentation. You can find the video for that on our website. It's on YouTube. I really recommend checking it out. And that subsidized affordable housing is great for the diversity, the socioeconomic and racial diversity of our city, but it comes at a cost. It has to be subsidized, usually by tax revenue in one way or another. And what we're going to talk about tonight is another great option to add affordable housing and other flexibility and diversity in terms of housing options in a way that has no cost to taxpayers. And that's accessory dwelling units, or ADUs. You also heard these referred to as granny flats or in-law units. They're something that are part of the housing stock. There might be one on your street. You might have one on your house that you maybe know is there. You might even not know it's there. But it's something that we're talking about because a new state law just took effect, expanding the scope of accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, which can be built by right in the state of Massachusetts. And Newton is currently, our city council is currently considering some matters that will bring us into compliance with that law. So we thought it was a good time to learn about this option for housing and understand both what the benefits are for homeowners and the communities that the ADUs are built in. And fortunately, we have the perfect guest with us here tonight to talk about this. Will Cohen is a senior planner at the City of Boston Planning Department, an expert on ADUs, and one of the authors of Boston's ADU Guidebook. And he'll be discussing the benefits of ADUs for people who own and build and live in them, as well as for the communities that they're built in. He'll offer some guidance on how to plan, design, and build ADUs, and then we'll open up things to take up questions from the audience. So Will, please. Take it away.
Mike still working? Great. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. Now that I'm a government official, it's worth noting I come to you this evening not representing official policy positions of the City of Boston for the City of Newton, but I do work at the City of Boston, so I'm coming to you as a practitioner, as a neighborly practitioner. I should also just note in terms of context, before I worked at the city, I worked at the planning consulting firm that does a lot of, on-contract planning work for the City of Newton. And so I was involved at the earlier couple years of the Village Center work. So I have some context for Newton, although I am not totally up to date with all the fun, exciting things that you all are doing here at the city. With that in mind, my goal will be to give it's not exactly an allegory. I'll give you some feedback, or I'll give you some information on what we're doing here, what we're doing over there at the City of Boston, and then I'll give some additional information about how we're trying to deal with that in terms of teeth when it comes to zoning. In some ways it's applicable, in some ways it will be instructive as an example, but I'm not weighing in with very specific recommendations or plans for what Newton should be doing. That is definitely outside of my lane these days. But I think there's a lot of things that are happening in Boston that the consequences of which are similar situations that Newton needs to think about too. And so that's how I want to frame this discussion this evening. On the point of the ADU law, the Affordable Homes Act, that's kicked this whole thing off, Boston is a little bit special. Well, Newton is special too. Boston is special from a zoning perspective because unlike every other municipality in the state, except for Boston, Boston derives its power to zone not through the State Zoning Act 40A, which is what Newton applies to Newton and every other municipality. That's where MBTA communities derives this power. It's a requirement, Section 3A of that chapter. And then there's also the modifications requiring allowing ADUs. That was an amendment to 40A. And so Boston, unlike you guys, didn't and doesn't have to follow the rules of MBTA communities nor this ADU regulation. So if there's sort of the carrot and the stick, we're taking a different, this ADU work is the carrot, right? We still have to amend zoning to accommodate these things, but we've had the time over the last year or so to think about what we want that vision to be. And I think a lot of the form situations where ADUs make sense in Boston will have applicability here in Newton too, which is important for you all to think about. So that's the framing of this talk this evening. All right, so I just want to also, classic urban planner, I do not do this alone. There are many, many smart urban planners with whom I work at the City of Boston. I am but a cog in the greater machine. But since I'm the one here with you tonight, you can feel free to email me for further follow-up. My email address is will.cohen@boston.gov. I have a stack of City Hall business cards right here, but these hardworking employees, civil servants, are really doing the legwork as well. All right, so there's this book. It's called the ADU Guidebook. We spent about a year on it. We had consultants help us do it too, but a lot of hard work and thinking in City Hall happened as well. We actually printed it out. Well, I can't give you all copies because it costs like $10 a copy, and city budgets are not that high, but we have copies of it in every branch of the Boston Public Library. If anyone at the City of Newton wants to formally hook us up with someone in the Minuteman branches, I'm sure we would be able to give a copy or two to get wider circulation if that's so interested. But in the meantime, you can also find it online on the Boston Planning Department's website. We have an interactive, it's called an ArcGIS story map that provides most of the content. There's sections of the guidebook cut out into smaller PDFs that you can print out for little pieces. And then there's a big honking PDF of the whole thing itself. And the purpose of it is to, and there's a link to it, and the purpose of it is to provide information for homeowners in the City of Boston, but you can feel free to use it in Newton as well, to think about how an ADU can make sense on your property. And this is sort of the carrot versus the stick of the law, which now applies to every other municipality in the state, right? The rule is that in every other municipality, you have to allow ADUs on single-family lots that are detached, with certain restrictions around parking and size and that kind of a thing. So with that in mind, the reason why this is important is technically in some form ADUs are legal in Boston already. They have been for a number of years, but only under extremely restrictive conditions. Those rules are that it has to be entirely within your building with no changes to the exterior. And if that's true, you can build an ADU, a basement or an attic or something. It's really hard to build an ADU in a basement. Like, very few basements are fully structured so that they have 2 means of egress per building code that would be independent from a main thing. So usually you have to add a door or something. That's a bump out on your building. That means you don't follow the rules in zoning. So the number of ADUs that are technically being built through zoning are very, very low. But we know this is something we want to see. And so as we're thinking about zoning, as complex as Newton zoning is, Boston's may be more complicated, I would wager. It is a 4,000-page zoning code, which is long. It's much longer than any other city in the United States. And so our plan is to figure out what the kind of ADUs we want to allow are, so we can actually write zoning that matches that. That's our process. And to give information, not just for us as practitioners to think about the zoning or whatever, but actually to provide guidance to everyone else involved in this process. It's a funny sounding name. There's a lot of letters in, ADU is already an acronym or abbreviation, right? How do you make this make sense? Is it always over an attic? Can only grannies live in these flats? These are the questions we have, right? And so we want to provide clear information that you can give to a homeowner who doesn't know how to read a site plan, to a contractor that's never built this kind of a thing before, to advocates for building ADUs to know what the realm of possibility is here in New England, and sort of to meet all these different audiences, which is really different than writing zoning. This document, as we were working on it, was also, it's audience-centric, right? This is not a zoning document in and of itself. It is tailored to those audiences. And one of the things that we really had to hone as we talked about this was all the reasons to build an ADU, right? And this is right out of how we were presenting. Most of this content is what we presented to the planning board and at public meetings around the ADU guidebook and our zoning efforts. And many of these benefits accrue directly to a property owner who would want to build an ADU. Why would I want to build an ADU? There are so many reasons you would want to build an ADU. It can allow you or loved ones to age in place. It allows you to take care and provide housing to other family members. It lets you downsize. It lets you get some extra income rental income. It lets you let your ne'er-do-well second child who won't leave the basement. You can have a dignified basement, whatever it's going to be. And as we did this outreach, we got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of comments. And we have an email address, adu@boston.gov. Anyone who wants to build an ADU can email. And I unfortunately am on that list along with everyone else in the city who's working on ADU. No, it's great. But we probably get 5 to 10 emails a day of people who just want to do this thing. And there's so many hurdles. And so this doesn't get rid of the hurdles, but it's a map to work through the hurdles. When I was preparing some of this presentation, Newton for Everyone said, that's great. I'm so glad that you, as a practitioner working in the system we live in, are explaining the benefits to property owners, but you're talking to a bunch of housing advocates outside of the city of Boston. Maybe you could try to expand your idea a little bit and think like a planner again. I mean, that's what I always do, but help us think like planners as to the benefits of ADUs more broadly to a community. These are the exact same things you can say to a homeowner, but spoken more generally, right? It's not just about being able to age in place. It is the ability to provide gentle density without teardowns. That's something which your neighbor, the person who's not necessarily aging in place, can get behind. This is a way to add housing in a way that doesn't fully upend what a neighborhood looks like, right? It's not just about providing housing for your dad or mom because you want to have them live nearby, unlike perhaps the way me and my spouse want to be living with our parents, or don't, but it's a way to allow people to stay in the city, right? Displacement is a real concern for many, many people. So this provides an ability, even in America, even in New England, to have multi-generational living happen, to make it viable, and to keep people where they are. This creates all different kinds of housing stock. A diversity of housing stock is a shared goal among many, many people, no matter what kind of housing you're living in. This is another way to think about housing affordability. It's not just that you can create things with lower rents. It allows property owners or people who are prospective property owners to be able to capture a plus, an income side in those calculations of what's affordable. So it makes living in Newton it makes owning property in Newton a little more viable if you can also potentially expect to be able to rent out part of it. Sort of a simple version of being a landlord, even if you're not going to own a big multifamily, right? It provides an option for students to continue to live in the city, right? There's a lot of students in the greater Boston area. They're not concentrated in Newton relative to many other municipalities across this region, right? And broadly speaking, this is catnip to a planner. This allows you to continue to meet the needs of changing demographic trends. What do I mean by that? This is like the structural question of the 20th century going into the 21st century. The housing stock built in Newton, in Boston, in every municipality in America post-World War II served the needs of the people living in those houses as they were built. And back when everyone had 2.5 kids and a dog, houses met those needs. But the average household size in many cases is less than 1 in most of the greater Boston area. And it's not that the city can't hold the number of people that we're talking about, but it is that units are not structured to accommodate how people are living in the year 2025 and beyond. And so this is a way to retrofit. This is a way to keep what we have and let it swing with the wind a little bit. And that's our goal. That is what that's one of the things urban planning does. And so with that in mind, we came up, and also urban planners and architects love a good taxonomy. We divided up the ways you can have an ADU on property, on Bostonian-ish property, into 12 different types. And the other big thing that we noticed, and this is something which I've poked around at some of the observations that the Zoning and Planning Committee is doing about residential updates to residential zoning here in Newton, that idea of narrow lots versus less narrow lots is a thing. And in many cases, that issue drove how we thought about ADUs here in Boston as well. And so, you can have lots that might be 20 feet wide, 50 feet wide, 60 feet and up. And how the width of a lot changes determines what is architecturally possible on these different kinds of lots. And so we also love puns as planners, right? We had choose your own ADU venture. By the way, if you're driving on the Pike or driving through downtown Boston, you may see billboards for this, like about building an ADU. This is the city of Boston trying to advertise this as we go. So you might see it over TD Garden, maybe not this chart, but an image. And so the idea is, depending on if you're on a small, medium, or large lot, what do you want? What do you want? Do you want a studio or a one bedroom or two? Then you have, of the 12, a certain number of these might work out for you. To be clear, things that work on smaller lots also work on medium lots. Things that work on smaller lots or medium lots also work on larger lots. But some only work on the larger ones. This is really critical for you all too. And this is because, as I'll get into a little bit later, that rule about the law for ADU zoning requires that you be able to build a detached ADU on single-family lots with some restriction about sizes, at least as we see it in Boston. And to some degree, this is going to be a consideration that the city of Newton may want to think about, is that a lot of ADUs in Boston are not going to be able to be detached. The fire code, which is a statewide thing, requires that you have between 10 and 20 feet of access clear, depending on exactly how an ADU or a second dwelling would be. If it's behind a primary structure, you have to have a lot of space for like a truck to get back there. And if you're in West Amesbury, Bridgewater, whatever it is, like most of the state, that's okay. Like, you probably have 20 feet of space around your house, but you do not, if you have a 20-foot lot, you don't actually have 20 feet of space. So you cannot build a detached ADU back there. This is not gonna happen. It's also very expensive. And so a combination, and it can't be a driveway, because if there's cars parked on it, the truck can't get through. So really, that needing to have like a 10 to 20 foot wide open path all the way back, not a big garden, not a driveway, but driveway-like, is a real high burden. And so in some ways, we're okay with the idea that the law about the ADUs doesn't apply to Boston, because that ADU production is actually probably fairly low based on the way lots are sized. Again, Newton is a suburb of Boston, but your lots are not all uniformly ginormous with like 4 or 5 acre zoning or something. And so to some degree, this may be a consideration you all want to think about. The good news is it's also cheaper. The smaller interventions are less work, less construction. That actually makes it more affordable. And so it's sort of a win-win in some ways. And so thinking about ways to have incremental modifications to existing buildings, separate from what the statewide Affordable Homes Act is saying the law should be, we're really excited about that as we're rethinking about zoning. The least noticeable from the outside is one where you actually don't do anything on the outside, but maybe the door, right? Where you're actually taking an existing unit and just making it into 2 units. They can be 2 smaller units. Maybe they're on 1 floor, maybe you're doing things between the basement or the attic. And so what we have, and this is where I think this is still very useful for you all, is we hired a bunch of architects and we took a lot of zoning planners and formerly architects who now work at the city of Boston to draw, represent visually a lot of information that is architecturally sound, but is not a specific architectural plan, but is clear enough that you can give it to an architect or a contractor to get some flavor for what you want, and you can feel confident that this is in the realm of reasonable. This will meet building code. This is the kind of thing that were zoning to be updated reasonably would likely be allowed under a reasonable updated zoning code, right? So we have like a picture of how it looks from the outside. It's a triple decker. You can't see any changes. You can see, oh yeah, I get the idea. There's some red here. This is where the new ADU would be. And then we lay out, here's a common triple decker-ish looking thing that's very common to Boston. Here's how the rooms often get laid out. And were you to want to split it into an ADU, here's what you should think about. You'll need a living room, you'll need a bedroom, you'll need a bathroom, you need a kitchen. Here's some reasonable sizes for a small but like livable, dignified unit. Here's one way it could kind of make sense. And then there's a lot of other annotations explaining the reasoning behind it, maybe some observations about zoning, or why this is a good scheme or why it's appropriate. So we always have, you know, an axonometric diagram, a site plan, a rendering, building plans, and then another idea about optionality, where we get beyond an exact building plan and say, that's the general idea, but look, there's many other ways you could do it. Maybe if you have a little bit of room, you could bump out a little bit. It doesn't just have to be about splitting. You could have an entire additional separate floor be dedicated separately if you're in like a multi-story house or something. You could enclose a porch, make a little bit of space back there. And then we give examples of things either in or near Boston, sometimes across the river, of buildings where this kind of intervention takes place to see how it is in the urban fabric of our region. So we have a couple of those for small lots. We then get a little more, we show some larger interventions at medium lots. I'm going to show a little bit about attachment on the side. This doesn't have to be on a corner. We have actually a separate one that's even more fancy about like going a little bit bigger on a corner lot. But an internal ADU is sort of the term of art for something where you're mostly inside the existing building, you're splitting or reconfiguring a building. Attaching would be one where it's still separate, but it's not a second building. And this solves, for Boston at least, a lot of these issues around the fire code, because you don't need all the same stuff to have an attached building, because all the fire prevention of one building applies to the next. So the fire truck doesn't have to get all the way to the one in the back. It's just the same building. It's still sort of accessible from the front in some form. But then on the other hand, other fire rules come into place, because once you hit 3 units and up, other kinds of stuff happen about building code. We even have a bunch of annotations there. You can see up at the top, there's a little picture where there's this guy, right? It's attached. You need to follow the International Building Code versus the, I don't remember what they stand for, the IBC versus the IRC. Some information about how egress can work, is going to be accessible or not. Relative cost of intervention, there's sort of a number of hammers. And then what do you got to do with fire prevention? Is it require sprinklering? In this case, you can probably get away, depending, with having just sprinklers in the ADU. In other situations, you have to sprinkler the whole building. And so we tried to give some guidance there. These are major cost drivers that determine a lot about what is or isn't possible. So that's another thing, right? At the very top of each scheme, we give sort of the order of magnitude of what you're talking about. We have a narrative around it. You can even see here, it says at the very beginning there, if you have 20 feet or more in one of your house's side yards, an ADU can be added next to your home. So in this case, you're not having to make the space for the fire truck, you just need the space for the ADU itself, which may apply in a lot of cases. Then it's a more okay. You can figure out your exact circulation, but you still have room for planting in your little yard and everything else that you want to have. And you can see it's tucked away, it's still visible, but it's there, right? And so it's a little bit larger. We highlighted it in purple in case you're missing the point. This is, in many ways, the idea of gentle density. It's there, it's not screaming at you. This is the vision of an ADU, but it's not detached, right? And so the state law does not require that this kind of zoning be updated in any municipality across the state, but it could be a good idea if you think about it. We also had the architects think through reasonable schemes. Again, this isn't going to be directly perfect for your one exact site plan. An architect will tell you that every building is special and you can't just like copy and paste these things, and that's true. But largely speaking, look, you can line it up so it's efficiently done. It doesn't have to be huge. You can make it fit, right? You can always make something fit. That is one of the main takeaways. Really, pretty much any kind of building could be reconfigured to add a unit. It just might be somewhere on the spectrum of 1 to 12 schemes. Which is an important lesson as we think about adding housing in a gentle way to our cities. We have some renderings for ways it could make sense. Some of the benefits, for example, like an open kitchen isn't just cool in the 2025 way to build things, but it actually does allow for space efficiency. It lets you split dining space versus cooking space, considerations that a non-architect might want to think about as they're doing their initial thinking. We jokingly call this a mood board backed by architectural expertise. With some more information, you could wrap it around, you could build it along the side, maybe it's part of a splitting your unit. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It could be attached, largely attached with internal work. It could be largely internal with a bump out. You can sort of mix and match it as you see. And we can also, as you can see, all of a sudden we're branching out into West Roxbury, Roslindale, parts of JP, parts of the city of Boston that are perhaps more Newtonian, where you can imagine these interventions lining up very, very well in the urban fabric of y'all's neighborhoods. And then we get to larger lots, and this is where they are, in fact, often detached, but not only. In fact, you can see that first scheme is attach an ADU in your front yard. Maybe you have a bunch of trees. Maybe you love your garden. Maybe you want to have an ADU and you don't want it to be in the backyard, but you have space. Maybe you can make that work. Again, the zoning law statewide isn't going to require that any city allow attached ADUs, but we still think there are situations where it can make sense. But then there's also backyard ones. So we have a smaller one and a bigger one, right? So here's a mid-sized one. Again, the fire code's a key. Boston's interpretation of the rules say that there are situations where if it's detached but mostly visible, I believe it is, you can get away with 10 feet, not 20 feet. So here, there's this path here. In fact, for anyone who's curious, the city of Boston does also have a painstakingly drawn out, again, interpreted by ISD at the city of Boston, the fire department at the city of Boston, but it's based on statewide laws. Guidance around ADUs and fire safety, that might be useful for any of you. I don't know the level of detail to which inspectional services in Newton has really had to tackle all the different ways that ADUs make sense or not. That might be instructive, but again, different jurisdictions. I don't speak for Newton. We made sure, so this is 1,000 square feet of gross square footage, but it's got a footprint that is still within the existing zoning rules, which are less than that. So it's 1,000 across 1.5 stories. So it's actually, I forget what the exact footprint of the building is. Let's see, it's like, oh geez. I don't have that set on me, but it's less than 1,000 square feet, obviously. It's probably more like 700 or 800. So that's where a story and a half gets you a lot. This is a big discussion, if I recall correctly, around village center zoning, that the role of the half story, the role of the pitched roof is, depending on how you do it, a way to squeeze space in a way that's not as noticeable. And that really plays a role in ADUs too. So that extra half story can still be effectively much like a second story, but small. I mean, obviously that's what a half story is, but it goes a long way, especially for where you are able to fit detached ADUs, because the footprint is really, in many cases, a really big challenge to find on sites here in cities. And look how lovely, who wouldn't want to live in that, right? That's the carrot. Look at that half story, every square foot being used efficiently with optionality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So how long am I going? Ooh, I went a little bit long, but I'm going to be fast. So that was a step. We got it adopted. It's now a document that we propose, but it's still not the zoning changes. And that's now what we are rapidly hurtling towards trying to figure out here at the city, to actually turn this into zoning, which, again, may have some applicability here in Newton, but not in a direct way, because we will never change your zoning. One lesson which has applicability not just in Boston, but in any municipality in the state and, dare I say, the country, is that zoning nonconformity runs rampant. We finally did the math. Everyone always knew the Boston zoning doesn't line up with what's actually there, but we finally checked. We only checked 4 things. We checked lot size, floor area ratio, and because we have to be different, what everyone else calls a setback, we call a yard, and unit count. And if you follow those 4 things, just those alone, don't even count parking, which is really saying something. 99, we rounded down. 99.7% of residential lots fail one of those 4 rules. So it looks like a yellow map of Boston with tiny dots of blue. It really is a yellow, none of it conforms. And I bet if you added in the other rules, we would easily hit 100% many times over. If it feels like everything in Boston needs a variance, it's because it does. That is the lesson, right? And so any path to by writing something isn't going to work if we're talking, and this is why we have to, oh, right. There is a path with the ADU law that if you're talking about detached things, you could say, sure. Don't worry about conformity when it comes to a detached ADU. Just allow the detached ADU and sort of let whatever non-tent is happening on the primary structure remain, grandfathered in, non-conforming, whatever that is. However, as I hope I kind of convinced you through my rambling, we are moderately convinced here at the city of Boston that detached ADUs play a role, but perhaps not the role in the ADU production in Boston, to actually allow for attached or internal with modifications ADUs. We have to tackle zoning on the primary structure. There's no easy way to say the zoning doesn't apply if it's an ADU, because in the end, what is an ADU? What's the difference between a renovation of your property that allows some more space and lets your mother-in-law live there versus calling it an ADU? What if you don't want to have renting it out? What if you just want to have the space be there for her, even if you don't have like separated means of egress and a separate unit structure, who's he what's it? And so that gets complicated very, very fast. And so that led us to realize that there I am smiling, talking to homeowners about how hard it's going to be for them. The problem to oversimplify the zoning is that if you have a building, look at this triple decker in Brighton, classic, right? I'm sure you drive by these things on the pike all the time. Our zoning usually says it has to be shorter than the existing building, smaller than the existing building, and in a different place than the existing building. That's what the zoning says. So you fail to follow setbacks, you fail to follow height, unit count, what have you. Our goal is to change zoning that's a little more wishy-washy, but still specific. It needs to wiggle with the existing building to deal with the fact that the vast majority of buildings were not built post-1967 when Boston's most recent zoning code went into effect, right? None of them had to follow zoning in 1920 when they were built, and they don't, so they don't. So we want zoning that can line up with that. There's a couple things that we have, and we want to update the zoning so that there's enough room for those ADUs to happen. Not always attached, not always in the backyard, but smaller renovations that are in line with the kinds of changes that we see people wanting to do all the time. So this is actually both and. It's about ADUs. It's also about small-scale renovations that cost extra many, many months in time and many, many thousands of dollars through the variance process in the city of Boston. So we're trying to tackle both of those, but really ADUs catalyzed it. Which isn't to say variances wouldn't happen. In fact, variances would just instead be what they're supposed to be for, which is wildly different things from what zoning says, or dramatically different things, or situations where there really is a hardship. We don't want the hardship to be that your lot is smaller than what zoning says a lot can be, even though most lots in that district are already smaller than what the zoning says. So that would then allow that discussion, that harder process, to be for projects that are more on the merits about that. That's our goal. We did surveys, not extensive. Again, this is like one of many, many things cooking at the planning department, but we got hundreds of responses. Even for this, we even got hundreds of people to respond to a not specific zoning proposal, generally about housing production. And we made people not just say what they want the world to be, but we made them put on their zoning code hat, so to speak, and say, if you really had to pick, what would you think about height versus bulk? What about this? What about this? There was some frustration from people that were like, that's not how I want to think about it. I want to tell you what I want the world to look like, and that's true. But our job is to write zoning code. And so we actually got some pretty good uptake on that. And one of the more interesting points was we asked people not what the role of the community should always be in development across the city. Right now, actually we know the answer. The answer right now is because everything needs a variance, there's a very extensive community process across the board. We have that answered. But in a world where zoning were changed, and if you were a property owner, what do you think is an appropriate amount of feedback your neighbor should be able to give on it? Try to put yourself in those shoes and answer that question. And we got two very different answers, both of which were the primary answers, which are both different, but as a planner, I would say very much compatible. One is you should have no feedback. No neighbor should have no feedback besides what's in zoning. If you're following the rules in zoning, you should be okay. That plainly read sounds a little bit like we don't need all this community process. But it's more subtle than that, because it's saying, assuming the zoning is being followed. That's not a situation we have right now, so it's a little bit hypothetical. At the same time, we heard a lot of other people say the second most common thing, and then the third most common thing, were that it's really important for neighbors to have input about dimensional changes, which really, as we saw from the nonconformity, is a huge piece of it. How close are you to the side of your lot? How big should the building be? That's a lot of what zoning's about. Or even more broadly, that it gets bigger than that. It's about noise, it's about shadow, it's about disruption, it's about generalized adverse impacts. Those two answers are kind of the opposite in some ways from no feedback. But after thinking a little bit about it, because that's what we do as government officials, we think a lot, you could argue, and I would argue, that those are actually very similar answers, assuming a state that is not the one we live in right now. Not state like Massachusetts, like a state of zoning that's not the one that we live in right now, right? If zoning were appropriate, if zoning were thought through logically, if there were a way to reasonably comply with zoning and build things, then it's reasonable to say that you shouldn't really have some feedback. If the zoning works, follow the rules. At the same time, all the stuff that people are doing in the city of Boston or in some other city that never follows the zoning, I have no idea what's going to happen. I have no faith in the process. It seems like people can get away with whatever they want if they just make their case ad hoc to the Zoning Board of Appeal, which is true. That is exactly what happens right now because it all gets variances. So that second point, if the zoning is appropriate, you don't got to be worried about the dimensional rules because the rules will actually be enforced and protect you from the thing you fear. That would be great. That would be actually zoning doing its job. And so we take that as a sign to keep going. We haven't figured it out yet, but we should keep going. So what we're doing right now is we're starting in the areas with large lots, areas where there's not this big mix of businesses, residential mixing up with industrial and commercial and everything else. We're sort of taking it easy. Places where there's already a little bit more wiggle room on the lots themselves. The most Newtonian parts of Boston, if you will. We're hard at work trying to write new residential zones that will allow for the flexibility we're talking about, allow for incremental changes, but still not be something where wholesale redevelopment of a neighborhood is possible. That would be a worst case scenario for people who move to Boston or those parts of Boston to be in those neighborhoods. I suspect some version of this discussion could be replicated with zoning changes in the city of Newton. So it's about dimension. Whatever. They can post the slides. I don't want to talk too much. But basically, it's about the flexibility. Side yard's a big one, where the rules are, that there's a balance to be served between allowing space for new development to happen, but also preserving the space from other properties. That is a critical balance to be struck. Doing it too much either way either allows for no change or is really hard to get behind if you're a property owner who's worried about your neighbors. One thing we're thinking about at the City of Boston is cumulative side yard. That it's not so much about the left or the right side, it's that you just gotta have some space. Maybe your building doesn't have to be right in the middle. Give it a little bit of flexibility. Have the space be required, but don't be so onerous in requiring 10 feet on both sides or whatever the rule might be. There's different parts of the city with different fabric. Lot coverage rules are not the same everywhere. We want to find a way to be systematic, but not overly prescriptive. We don't want to recreate the thing which isn't working well. If we have 900 bajillion zoning districts, we want to make fewer than that in the new zoning code. Some ideas we have are to use the actual sizes of lots themselves as the trigger that would sort of have multiple rules within a zoning district so that we're not drawing a million little districts. Parking is complicated. While parking is important to a lot of people for zoning, you can see the tale of someone who conforms with the parking required in Boston versus someone who never actually built the parking required many years after the property was built in the first place. And I think everyone can agree usually that having parking requirements force everyone to pave their yards, especially if it's just to build a darn ADU, is probably not an ideal outcome. So we need a solution there. The role of design review versus having things be by right is a hotly debated topic that we are thinking hard about, as well as other typologies that may not be in Boston all the time, but could be appropriate. What about lots that are bigger? What about lots that aren't just a classic single-family house, where it's 3 times the size of an existing property, but like more units would be reasonable there? But if we're going to enter this world where by right is the path, what do we need to think about so by right leads to good outcomes? That is exactly what I know you all were thinking about through MDD community zoning, and I suspect that's in your residential work as well. Then, of course, there's just the broader planning idea that for all the importance of open space, which is very important, for everything that I'm talking about, there's an equal and larger amount of work being done by the Parks Department, landscape architects, and all the other work to make sure that permeable open space and a just, resilient community is what we do in Boston. There's also the broader idea of sustainability and that smaller units in cities create much less carbon. And so the idea of sustainability isn't exclusively about green space. It's also about reducing our carbon footprint, and something like an ADU, adding units where we already are, is a great way to do that. The last thing, which we can talk about in the Q&A if you want, is then, fine, so let's say we change all these things. What about, the home daycares? What about people working from home? Not just your office space, but actual businesses where you're not with a retail component, but you're providing services. Like it could be, a therapist working out of their house or something. How do we have that be allowable in zoning and regulate in a way where those things get to be by right and regulated, but still make sure that there's a residentialness to it all? We're thinking through that too. And we've been very happy to use as much guidance as we can from other people who aren't just in New England. Houston has been a very successful example. If you're worried about the sky falling, the sky did not fall in Houston, right? That's the lesson of ADUs there. Portland, Oregon, this fear about owner occupancy requirements, disallowed in the statewide law. Whether or not the requirement's there, it's usually homeowners who do the thing. The fear of sort of developers using this as a way in has largely not borne out there. The idea of more housing leading to rents going up. Minneapolis is a classic example of where liberalized zoning about housing production actually causes rent to go down, despite the case in every other city or region, Boston and Newton being notable counterexamples to Minneapolis. And then just we in Boston, we like to say we're the best at everything, but yet the laws don't apply to us and we haven't done any of it. And so that might help us achieve these goals as we work on it. And even if the law doesn't apply to us, you all implementing ADU zoning hopefully is a rising tide that lifts all boats. It actually makes this new kind of typology more doable, more reasonable, and more viable for homeowners struggling to figure out what on earth all this stuff is. And with that, I will stop talking. I'll leave up as my last slide. Newton for Everyone asked me to put this up. This is a QR code, which they will talk about, but is about the work you're doing here in the city of Newton to sort of take this step even further.
Great. Will, thanks so much. That was great. So we're going to open things up to some questions. Make sure you ask a question. Last time, some people didn't ask questions. I really want you to ask a question. No comments. And please keep your question to under 30 seconds. If you can't do that, I will help you. And so, yeah, we'll go and we'll intersperse some questions from the Zoom as well. But I see Susan, we'll start over there.
Just wanted to say that I think because Newton is subject to Chapter 40A, I think we were actually in a good place because we were forced to follow the state regulations, which vastly liberated our ADU rules. So I want to be sure that Newton for Everyone, by the end of March, we will have new rules. And I hope that you can distribute them to the people who are here for this meeting, because in many ways, we're a little bit ahead of you, as you say.
You're way ahead of us.
Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to say is that you made a comment early on that an internal ADU can't be attached, but in fact, our land use committee just approved one where the home is having an addition put on, and the addition will be the ADU, and that's considered an internal ADU.
Yes,
so
you're right. I'm sorry.
keep that
I
in
misspoke.
mind as you make your plans. And we hope, Luke, I hope that you will distribute our rules to these people. Thank you.
On that note, I should note that the planning department at the City of Newton, you have a killer staff of extremely competent civil servants who do very good work. And I was frantically trying to catch up on both the proposed ADU regulations and the residential zoning that's in the works, coming off the heels of your past MBTA communities legislation. You should follow all those things. You are hard at work chewing on it. And so I definitely, I think actually you all may have had ADU rules, sort of an internal version of it, or those kinds of conversions. If I recall correctly, that was even in place years ago when I was working on Village Center. So in many ways, you are very much ahead of Boston. So I want to just note that some of what I get stuck in is very much a different city.
We're going to let Councilor Albright be the one non-question comment. Everyone else has to ask a question.
Hi. I'm going to ask this in relation to Boston, which you know, and I'll have to look and see what Newton says. But how is an internal ADU conversion different from converting to a single-family home to a two-family home?
That's an excellent question. And this is something which we're trying to figure out in zoning too. So to the fact that it's confusing is correct, I guess, is step one. For the purposes of Boston, it's a couple things. It's the existing rules that says if you're doing it entirely internally, you don't got to follow the zoning if it's an ADU. So basically, all that nonconformity, you are freed from all those problems when it's an ADU if you meet those rules. So there's a benefit you get by calling it ADU. There's also currently a rule also in Boston that says you have to be owner occupied if it's an ADU. So you get a benefit, but then also that means that you have to live in it. in the building itself. So people who want to build an additional unit but are not going to be owner occupants do not apply to build ADUs in the city of Boston right now. They file for a change of use to make it be a two-family or something like that. The other big piece would be the degree to which ADUs are an additional above and beyond what the zoning says. So if the zoning is single-family, the ADU would be another one. If the zoning is two-family, you may not, like in a situation like that, a property owner may not need to be thinking about an ADU at all. They would just go from a single family to a two family. And so it kind of depends on what you have. And so in Mattapan, which is the one neighborhood that has been rezoned to allow ADUs by right, I should have said that. It's not true anywhere except for Mattapan right now in Boston. That went into effect last year. The ADU is the +1 above and beyond what zoning says is the base zoning. And in those situations, the last piece is that's what makes it accessory. It's a unit that is smaller than accessory to the primary, whatever that is. And so the statewide law says it's only, this law has to be allowed, it has to happen in single family districts. So there can now be a second unit, which is smaller than or up to a certain size, the existing unit, it's a second one. But if you're in a two-family district, just make it a two-family.
We have a few questions from the folks online, who, by the way, were also laughing at your jokes, so excellent. We have a few questions from the folks online about financing and who pays for these. One question is, I think you started to answer this, are investor-owned properties eligible for ADUs? And if not, should that change?
So the statewide rules say, so again, so under the single-family requirement one, that owner occupancy is, 40A now is modified to say that owner occupancy is disallowed as a potential requirement, meaning that a city can't say that an ADU has to be owner occupied. So it could be an investor-driven property. However, as evidenced by that Houston example and also New Hampshire, Vermont, places where they've been permitted. This is not the easiest way for an investor to make a buck. Like haggling over an additional small little unit in someone's backyard is like the most complicated way imaginable to try to build a unit of housing if you're not a property owner. And so it's true that it could be possible, but we don't expect that that's really going to be the driving force of ADU development. Now, the separate issue about financing is a different one, which is that it's still a unit of, it's like building a house. It just happens to be a smaller one. Like building an ADU is a major thing. It's on the order likely of hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's part of why this guidebook, like the majority of the schemes are not separate detached structures. As cute as a tiny house is, it's a very expensive way to build a unit. And so in many cases, a smaller, more incremental change to a property is a lot cheaper. The catch though is that depending on the rules and zoning, you know, you pay one way or you pay another way. Either it's a cheaper kind of intervention on your building, but you're going to pay through the regulatory process, versus, you know, a detached one that maybe is easier to get through, but is still expensive to build. The last piece there is just that that's an important note for property owners, that this is never going to be like the equivalent like of a bathroom redo. Like even a bathroom, like we just redid our bathroom in our single family house in the city of Boston. And even that, where it was an existing bathroom getting redone, plus tiling the other one, like that was on the order of $50,000. Like you're not building a house for $50,000. And so that's really, really important for property owners to be aware of, that this requires a commitment and it's complicated and you probably need an architect. And so, you know, the city of Boston has some grants, some assistance. I'm sure Newton's like working on it, but or maybe has it, I shouldn't speak out of turn. But in many cases, this is where the ability to think about rental income as a way to finance, like some way of acquiring financing to do this is going to be a complicated piece for a property owner. And that's part of why you got to get a sense of how big your operation is going to be so you know what you're looking at before you get too deep.
Hi. Yeah, what do you see as controls for the problem of short-term rentals and the use of ADUs?
So the city of Boston's official answer to that would be that short-term rentals are disallowed in ADUs right now in the zoning code of Boston. This is very similar to the whole idea of owner occupancy as well. There's like a lot of ways where all these rules are overlapping and interlocked. But for short-term rentals in Boston, you're supposed to file with the city be registered as one. There's some regulatory oversight over it. I suspect there's some similar kind of parallel version of a regulatory regime around short-term rentals here in Newton. Don't quote me on that. I don't actually know. But I think the question becomes one of separating the ADU from the short-term rental. And so that's a decision that that Newton needs to make about all of its different housing units. And generally speaking, as a planner, I think it makes a lot of sense to try as much as possible to have ADUs be subject to the same, again, there are some exceptions to this, it is more nuanced than that, but as a general rule, it makes sense to have the rules of an ADU be similar to that of many other units of housing, because the more the restrictions go on an ADU, the more that becomes like a strange rent unit of housing subject to a whole separate regulatory regime. If it's, again, it can't be owner occupied, so that's irrelevant here, but like, were that rule to be in effect, what happens if an aged property owner passes, their children inherit a property, don't live in it, like now technically that ADU, which someone was living in, is illegal to be occupied. It's a violation of zoning and thus needs to be, like someone needs to be sent, like evicted from it, and it needs to be deregistered or something. Like, you know, there's many very complicated other ways that regulations relate to one another. And I think the main thing that we're seeing about ADUs is they're not really a loophole to redevelopment. They are an additional allowance that property owners have. And with that sort of overall constraint weighing it down, I think that mitigates a lot of the other concerns that people have about things like short-term rentals, owner occupancy, and other kinds of requirements. But that's my speculation.
Another question related to financing from the folks on Zoom. They're wondering, who finances these? Like, can you get a mortgage for this? Is it your local banker? Is it somebody else? How do you kind of do that concrete bit?
That's between, well, okay, so the snarky answer is that's between you and your higher power. But more broadly speaking, yes, absolutely. Like, it's like a really big renovation. So a really commonly used tool for this kind of situation is a home equity line of credit, right? You've got some, presumably for your homeowner, you have some amount of equity, some assetness in your house. And in the same spirit that a home equity line of credit is how people can renovate their house, you use your house to update your house. And so the question is whether or not that amount of equity is available to a homeowner. And if not, then it gets a little bit more complicated. But you know, that challenge of how to pay for it is the challenge. You can hire an architect to design whatever you want, but in the end, you need to be able to afford it. And so, again, just speaking to the kinds of interventions we're seeing in Boston and the kinds of ADU-like things that are actually making it through the variance process, they're usually more modest. Like, there aren't a lot of large, tiny homes being proposed despite needing a variance. It's usually attics, basements, and small bump outs to make new units, because when it comes down to it, that's already a major, major expense.
Can you talk a little bit about how the regulations might interact with historic district if you're trying to cite an ADU in a historic district?
The sky's the limit in how they could interact. Broadly speaking, I think putting on a planner hat, and I'm not a historic preservation planner, so I'm a little bit outside of my deep wheelhouse here. In Boston, usually there's like things that are landmarked properties where they're under a very restrictive set of rules around zoning and changes. Think the Back Bay, where any kind of modifications to structures are very, very difficult to get approved. In a situation like that, I think an ADU is likely not realistic, because that is a substantive change to a building. It's hard for people to even replace their windows there. Separate from that is issues around things like national registers, softer kinds of historic designations where there's character to be considered, where design review comes into play. In Boston, for example, there's a lot of in certain parts of the city, there's additional design review that buildings have to go through. And sort of in that netherworld of not like truly landmark properties to things with historic character, I think that's where it is important for the city to for you all collectively to work toward figuring out where you want that balance struck. An argument in favor of allowing things like ADUs is it makes it a lot easier to keep the things that are there and adapt them to the future versus let a building sort of not be able to be invested in, maintained, and kept, and then eventually have a better case for tearing it down. An argument in favor of not doing this is that the way it is the historicness. And so, there's an inherent tension in that conversation.
Thank you. In my experience in Newton, one of the major reasons for the ADUs is intergenerational living. And I just wanted to see if is that true in Boston and the rest?
Absolutely. Overwhelmingly, much of what we hear from people is people who just want to take care of their family. Again, this is not a way to get rich. This is a huge investment. It's very complicated. It takes a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, especially given the existence of Boston's crazy zoning code. And so anyone who wants to build an ADU right now is doing it because they have something they want to achieve that isn't exclusively profit-driven. And one thing that's been very important to us as we work through this is to really try to uplift those stories so that it doesn't just, so to help provide a balance to a narrative that can form, which is that this is a way of encouraging developers to get rich.
I have one more very practical question, which is, how does somebody find builders, architects, people who specialize in this kind of work? It's not as common yet in Boston. I don't know if Boston's doing things. The question is, from the person online, could they find the same thing from Newton? Is there a registry of people who've done these kinds of work, any kind of support in that world?
So when you email the city of Boston to ask that exact same question, they will tell you there is not a preferred architecture list. It is inappropriate for city governments to be telling you what builders to use. It's just that's a conflict of so many different things. And that can be true, but more generally, there are lists of people that you can talk to. The Boston Society of Architects, which is the local professional organization, has a list of all architectural members of all practicing architecture firms that are registered with the BSA. You can filter by places where they work. You can filter by residential housing. You can search for terms. You can type in things like accessory, ADU, et cetera, and get lists of things. A combination of that plus, let's call it internet sleuthing for New England architects who do ADUs, they are out there. There's not, to my knowledge, a good centralized list of resources. I acknowledge that is in fact also a struggle. Part of why we wanted to make this guidebook is so that you don't have to find someone who built an ADU already to figure out how to build an ADU. In the same way you find an architect to do anything, we're trying to provide information so that anyone who is an architect can pick up the pieces and help you out. That is our goal. And so we hope that information still provides use outside of our city limits. I apologize for my vocal fry. It is really a lot tonight.
Similar question to the last one, which was, I feel like when there's profit to be made, there's marketing. So you get pamphlets about, we'll redo your doors or your windows or, all these different things. We'll do your boiler because we're doing the neighborhood. Has anyone who's done ADUs yet in any city gotten to the point where, to the same question, there are architecture firms or builders sending emails out or whatever flyers
Someday.
hey, someday. But it just hasn't happened yet. It's not, to your point about it not being a great profit venture, it is just a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and architects and builders just don't want to get involved right now.
Contractors love coming to our public meetings and spamming their contact info in the chat. That's a separate issue than having a proven track record of builders of ADUs in the city of Boston. I suspect that will get better with time in the same way that anyone who bought an electric vehicle in the last decade struggles to charge it, but it gets easier every single day. That's a bad metaphor, but I think you know what I mean. I hope this same problem isn't one that we have in a few years, but it remains to be seen.
I actually will say on that point, in California, where they've had a more expansive ADU allowance for a couple of years, there are firms that are specializing in kind of they're trying to make a kind of streamlined online process where they understand the regulations. A lot of it is constructed in a modular fashion. So it is, again, the homeowner has to be choosing to do that, but that is a place where there are different, I think several firms some people are, again, focusing on the regulatory part. Some are doing cool things with construction techniques and things. These are smaller things. You can put stuff on a trailer and just drop it on the site. So I think theoretically, it might be that with this expansion in ADUs that the state law is hoping to have, you might see firms start to do that. Maybe some of the California firms would come out here, we'd start some here. So it'd be interesting. We might see something like that. I think we're gonna wrap up the questions there. Want to thank Will again for his expertise. Will's been great. Give a round of applause, please. Yeah, really great, Will. Thank you for sharing your time and expertise. We also want to thank Dennis Milligan for helping us out with the Zoom and all the audio-visual stuff. If you enjoyed this event and would like to hear about more events like this, please sign up for our mailing list. There was a list outside. You can also find it on the website. We're going to have more events like this later in the year. In April, we'll have an event about the environmental implications of building more housing for climate change, which we're really excited about. We'll have other events coming up around workforce housing and the effect of market rate housing on affordability. Lastly, I have a request to make for all of you. Involving this QR code that's up here, which is that we would like you to reach out to the City Council. There's a matter in front of the City Council right now, again, around our compliance with this new state law. Two of the policy changes that we are advocating for that would go beyond what the state law calls for, but which we think as Newton for Everyone is a really good idea, are to allow up to 1,200 square foot ADUs by right. The current limit is 900, and we think giving that extra space will give people more flexibility to do things like have a second bedroom for a caregiver, for an elderly member of their family that's staying with them, or other ways of flexibility. So we'd like you to mention, if you can reach out to the City Council, that we should go to 1,200 square feet by right, and also to allow for the full utilization of carriage houses, historical carriage houses. Right now, that you're not allowed to use it, you have to be limited to the square foot. But if you have a 1,300 square foot carriage house, it's kind of silly if you're only going to be allowed to build a unit into 900 square feet of it. What are you going to do with that other 400 square feet? It's a little awkward. You got to finish it. You got to keep it out of the elements. It's not a good idea. Use the whole thing. It'll help you retain the carriage house more than will be preserved. It won't be torn down. We think it's a good idea. If you think it's a good idea, you can point your phone at this, take a picture of it. It's also going to be an email that Josh is going to send you. It'll help you write a letter, reach out to the City Council, tell them you think it's a good idea. Hopefully they'll all vote for it. So yeah, that's what we've got. Thanks for coming tonight, and have a good evening.